So, but we'll get started here. And what we've been talking about was really the key couple of chapters to the story of First and Second Samuel. In a lot of ways, it's, I don't know. I think most people would say that the Exodus and Moses at the Red Sea is kind of really the key moment of the Old Testament, and this is probably right behind it as far as kind of the real crucial moments in shaping everything that comes afterwards. And so we were chapters 8, 9, and 10 of First Samuel, and it's like we've seen, I think, in each segment so far, it's a really timely study. It talks about politics, it talks about power, and that's really I think the real good discussion point for us today is, and as we've been going along this study, we've been focused on how the storyline carries along with personality that's involved, with the kind of socio-political background, just what's going on in the world around them, and then also and primarily what God's interaction is through the storyline. And those all kind of come together here in chapter 8. So with that in mind, what were some initial impressions kind of reading through that story again? I know First Samuel 8's probably one of the better known passages when Israel cries out for a king. So to kind of just get us rolling a little bit, what are some things that stood out to you in the story, or maybe you hadn't thought about, or questions you might have?
Well, when I go back and read a lot of these stories in the Old Testament, I always find myself getting a little jealous of those that could have these what seem to be very personal conversations with God. Samuel's like, he's having a hard day, he's having a hard time talking with these people, and he just goes and talks to God, and God's talking to him. I mean, it's like, like us right now on a Zoom call. It's like, I find myself sometimes just feeling like, man, how much easier would it be sometimes if, we were having a hard time dealing with the situation, and we could just ask God, and it was so, it's at least how Scripture depicts it. It was like us having a conversation, and that's, I know not necessarily I don't think the purpose of the story, but I mean, throughout the Old Testament, it's just that type of interaction that God had with certain people was one that, like I said, oftentimes I feel a little jealous of. So
it's funny you bring that up. There's a kind of a weird little. It's almost it's not a big thing, but I think it was in chapter 10, where they're going to anoint Saul, and the people don't know where he is, and it says that they asked God where he was, and he said, "Oh, he's over there among the baggage." Like, it's like this really small, fairly insignificant thing, which is kind of funny because the whole point of the story is, kind of providing this connection for the people to God and a leader, and yet they have this direct connection for like I mean, at least the way it's presented, it's even, it's kind of like even more intimate than Zoom. It's like he's just across the hall, like, "Hey, where's Saul?" Yeah. Now he's over there.
Yeah, it seems like it's not a prophetic kind of statement from God. It's just a mundane kind of always over there.
Right. Yeah. So it does allude to the kind of closeness of God. And that, I mean, when I've taught the Old Testament a few years ago, I mean, I came to kind of feel like what you really have is in the garden, Adam and Eve and God are there together, and they're intimate, and they walk together and all that stuff. And then they get kicked out of the garden. And then I feel like there's just this gradual distancing between the people and God that happens over hundreds of years. I mean, with Abraham, it's still very intimate, very close. He's meeting with them. With Moses, he's in the temple or out in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting outside of the encampment. But he's still right there, and they see him all the time. And then, but it's just like as farther along you go in the Old Testament, the more distance the people seem to be. And God's interactions with them are more, less frequent and less visible. So yeah, that's definitely something that comes about. Anything else come up when you were reading through here?
I guess one thing that always amazes me is God giving us free will. And, it's pretty clear that this was going to be a bad tour for him, a bad route, It's not going to work out very good. And yet God in his love and wisdom allows it to go on. And that wouldn't be my choice if I was God. I would not let these crazy things happen, but somehow that's the way he wants us to live. Free will.
The fact that probably it may be in some ways the biggest surprise in the whole Bible is that God gives them a king, because all the lead up is it ain't gonna happen. They've rejected me as king. They didn't want them to have a king, and it's very surprising that he gives in, or I don't know what the right word is. He gives it over to them, and allows it to happen, and certainly that, I mean, I had really kind of planned to talk about free will, but you're right, Marv. I mean, this is like a great example of free will and the sovereignty of God kind of all coming together here. Because if it was God's will in some kind of like my way or the highway, they wouldn't have a king. I mean, that wasn't the choice that he had made for them, and yet he gives into their wishes, which I think does bring up a question of why. Why would he do it? Why would he go? And it brings up the whole idea of our kids sometimes, and eventually having to turn them over to their desires to kind of learn on their own. I think that's a pretty good analogy for that. Anybody else?
It's maybe the one thing I pick up on is again how God finds or uses the most unassuming, least like recognized, or going to the tribe of Benjamin and a family that even Saul himself says, there's nothing special about us. Why in the world would I be, why would God want me or want that to happen? Even up through when Saul starts to prophesy and people are just confused as to why that's even allowed to happen, because they know who his father is. But that's a common theme throughout, where God uses these people to further the story that nobody, they don't see it coming. They don't see where it's coming from. They don't, and they have a hard time understanding why God would use those people.
Yeah, there's a great ironic story. Saul goes out he goes on a donkey hunt. And I think that's an intentional kind of use by the writer. He goes on a donkey hunt and he ends up with the king. I mean, that's kind of basically the trajectory of this story. And what's interesting about it is the story begins rather inauspiciously, because when we finished off in chapter 7, Saul was the de facto kind of leader over Israel as a prophet. What did leadership look like before the kings and the judges? The judges are kind of unique, but if God is accusing Israel of rejecting him as king, what did that look like? What was that supposed to look like? So we know Saul becomes king, and then David and Solomon, and then off we go. But if that wasn't really the plan, we say, well, God was their king. Well, what did that look like in Israel's life before this time period? What was their leader, or who?
The elders, wasn't it? Didn't they have? They were broken up into small groups, and each group had an elder, probably a father, a patriarch type figure. And then you had a council of elders would be
they were all subject. They were all subject. They were all subject to what? They were all subject to the Torah.
Torah, yeah.
And that was the idea, is that the Torah and the interpretation of the Torah, because when Israel was, because we have to remember this, because we're going to kind of come full circle to this. Israel was let out of a king. They were led away from Pharaoh, and they got to Mount Sinai, and God says, "Yeah, we're doing things different now." And He doesn't give them a king. He doesn't give them even really a formalized high priest or somebody who's going to basically call the shots, but instead He gives them the law. He gives them the Torah on Mount Sinai and says, "This is going to be your rule of life, and that's what's going to set you apart from everybody else." And so when they get to this point, that's really what they're rejecting. They're rejecting that kind of life, which the ironic thing was, there's really not any crisis that has created this situation. Not really. Now it says that Samuel's sons had become, he was passing the torch to his sons, and they weren't doing a very good job. It kind of repeats the story we saw with Eli and his sons, right, in the beginning of the book. And now Samuel's in that same position, but it doesn't necessarily present it as like this crisis. We've met the Philistines. We know that the Philistines are here. They're going to become kind of a foil for Israel moving forward. But it wasn't as though they were surrounded by Philistine army and they were looking at Samuel going, "You got to give us a king to get us delivered." It kind of just is. And it's like this growing malcontent or discontent from the people, and they decide that they want a king like everybody else. And so I think, and this is the reasons, Val, I thought you would enjoy a discussion, but it's like as human beings, we have this constant struggle with what do we do with power and how do we interact with leadership? Because, if you're raising your kids, I don't know why anybody would want their child to grow up and be famous, or why anybody would want their kids grow up to be president or someone in power like that. Because it's easy to say, oh, it's all the things that come along with fame, but man, those positions are so ripe with problems and issues. And you can look outside the Bible, you can look inside the Bible. I mean, it's a constant problem that we have as human beings. And what I love about the story of Saul is that wherever you fall in the political spectrum, if you get to either end, if you're kind of a libertarian, you love this story, and if you're kind of more of an anarchist, you love this story, because they both speak to the difficulty we have in how are we supposed to manage ourselves politically, because politics just means people, right? It just means city and organization. And Israel kind of come to a crisis politically, where they feel like they need somebody, like they need a leader. And what's amazing is that very famous passage where God tells Samuel, well, go tell him what a king is going to do. This is what their life is going to be like. And Brueggemann, in his commentary, said this is the greatest statement against kind of public power anywhere in the Bible. And so he tells them that the king is going to draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers, making them run before his chariots. Some will be generals and captains in his army. Some will be forced to plow in his fields and harvest his crops, and some will make weapons and chariot equipment. The king's going to take daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes. He's going to take 1/10 of your grain. I mean, we're reading this thinking, oh, taxes are only going to be 10%. That's not so bad, right? We can handle that. But he goes on and he just hammers them with what's coming. And of course, their response is, even so, we still want a king. And I think in a lot of ways, that's, as we read these stories, we're learning a lot about God and we're trying to learn a lot about ourselves. And I think we can see ourselves in this dilemma. What do we really need as leadership and in our leaders? And so what is this kind of constant, like, conflicting challenge we have with our leadership, with those who lead us? It seems like we always feel like we need them, and we never seem to like what we have when we have them. Does that seem to be kind of a fair assessment?
Well, the problem is we know when leadership, we have a sense of what bad leadership is. In other words, we've all experienced it one way or another, directly or indirectly. And so we're on a constant search. And that's what's neat about democracy, is that you have an opportunity to continuously challenge the authorities with their leadership skills. And if we don't like it, eventually we can remove them. I mean, it may take some work, it may take some time, but it's not something that's going to be inherited. It's not going to be permanent. And that's why I think the founding fathers were genius in that respect, in that we have an opportunity to continuously, now it may cause some lack of stability. It may a little bit of stability, but at the same time, you don't have to continuously be inundated with bad decisions, bad leadership, or whatever. You got a chance to move it. And when you have a king like that, kings don't act that way. Same way dictators, kings, whatever you want to call them.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's what was genius about what the guys that put this country together were able to do, is they understood leadership in that respect, that it can be corrupting as well as positive. And so you got to have a system in place to put a check on that. So they put the checks and balances within the system itself, and then they gave people the right to vote to get rid of people if they don't function properly. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, because that's at the heart of the issue, right? Is finding a balance between, you have to have stability. I mean, that's the problem with like an extreme idea of anarchy is just kind of like, hey, you're at the qualm of every day. So you don't want every day to be kind of chaotic. But because the one thing you would say about dictators or monarchs is they create stability, and that's what happens all around the world when a dictator is removed. For all the bad things you can say about them, they created stability, and there's a lot of times this big power vacuum that comes on the back end, and it speaks right to this issue. Like, you have to have some kind of leadership. There has to be something there, and we realize that because, like Val said, we know what poor leadership looks like. We can think of that, whether it's in a small scale or in a big scale. We know what leadership. We know what poor leadership can ultimately do. I mean, we know how destructive it can be. And so, the idea of really early in the Israel's existence, power is it's like Lord of the Rings, it's that Deb, you know that story better than me, right? It's the precious, and you get a hold of it, and it just takes over. And I think that's the challenge that God and his people are constantly wrestling with. You see the same thing happen in the New Testament when with the church. What are you going to do with leadership within the church? How do you handle that hot potato? I think it's a really, really challenging thing for God's people to navigate, because you have, what as Christians we're always asking, what's God's plan in this? How do we understand leadership from a godly perspective? But we're all citizens of some kind of, whether we're all citizens of the United States, but we're all citizens of somewhere with differing understandings of what leadership, should look like and should be. And we all have different personalities. So as much as this is about, Saul becoming king, it's really about power. And what God basically tells the Israelites is this is what happens when you're going to give somebody that much power. Because up till that point, they hadn't done it. It had been, they'd been under the sovereignty of God through his selected leader who didn't function like a king. And I think the challenge for us in reading this story is you don't just conflate it with our situation in the United States, or whatever country you happen to be in. It's related, and there's things that we connect with, but it's really a bigger question of power in general, and then it's probably more directly related to power in the church, and how we seek authority in the church, and how we interact with the authorities that we do have in our government, which apparently is a controversial thing. Not everybody believes the same thing about that, right? And that makes it further complicated in that. So luckily Marv is here, and he, I think, is an expert and will lay this all out. I told Diane you had to lead the discussion today, Marv. Did she pass along that information?
No, she didn't, and that's why I attended.
So what else? What do you guys think about this? I think it's tough.
Well, all you got to do in modern times, look, we talk about the church. Look what happened to the Catholic Church. In the sense that it became politicized, back in the day, rather than focused on its original purpose, and it just about blew itself up, and it's still basically recovering from that whole era. It never has fully recovered from it. Really tainted the church. The word church itself became tainted because of what took place in the 14th and 15th centuries and beyond. And that's one of the reasons why the Christian faith is so, I don't know where divided, but it's certainly got a lot of different points of view and groups that represent it. And the reasons being is because what happened in that period of time when the Catholic Church forgot its purpose.
You just blame all our problems on the Catholics, Val?
No, I'm just saying it. But
I'm not just kidding.
It's historically true. I mean, it's,
yeah.
in that respect, it is
right.
historically true.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason why I find this to be such an important study. I mean, it's such an important discussion because, when you pull it back and don't make it just about kind of government or politics, and you really frame it in the bigger topic of power, that's something everybody needs to consider. And not just power, but authority. I mean, if you look at what's happening in our world over the last 20 to 30 years, is power is really kind of changed in how we assume. I mean, that's how Donald Trump became president. I mean, power all of a sudden is not a political entity. I mean, it has this morphing of celebrity to it, to where you have all these outlets, and suddenly, somebody can start a YouTube channel, and Mike Schreiber can get on TikTok and have 500,000 followers, or, and 500,000 views, and all of a sudden he has authority based on his platform. And I think that's going to continue to emerge in all these kind of additional, problems that we see that we could have never imagined. Okay, now all of a sudden somebody who has authority, well, how important is truth now? And because that was always assumed, they would just tell you how it was. Well, now we know it's gotten more complicated, and it just furthers us into this question that I think we have to wonder. How do we understand authority, and what is our role in who are we to subject ourselves to, and how so? And I think within the church, I think it's a really, really difficult issue. I think it's a really challenging thing, especially in our country, because we're not very good at subjecting authority, because we've been told ever since we were born, our country's founded on democracy, and everybody gets a vote, and every person has has their right. And I think that's a really important, valuable thing. But the Bible kind of presents this idea that, well, but God is moving and active. I mean, what's interesting is God doesn't have Israel take a vote for who they think the next king should be. And I think that's sometimes something we forget. We so quickly run from the people crying out for a king to Saul becoming king that we forget that they didn't have any business. They didn't have Saul in mind. Like, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, we have this great leader among us. That dude should be our king. Their desire arose out of, we need a king. Like, we have this lack of king. And he goes on to talk about all the difficulties that king's going to be. And like Brian said earlier, then he shows up and they're like, well, who's this dude? He's clearly not the king. So that's what's really kind of ironic about this story, is they finally get what they wanted, and it still wasn't what they really wanted. So I think that the story that follows is fascinating.
I think it's interesting that God recognizes that the people, basically aren't going to give this up, this idea, and again, like I said, I don't know how to frame it, whether he gave in or just, whatever, but in his wisdom decided, okay, we're going to provide, and I'm going to provide a king for them. But it is an interesting thing to note, Adam. You're right. Yeah, they weren't, there's no vote. There was no go out and, okay, Israel, go find yourself a king who you think is worthy. They still recognize God as the authority,
right,
even though they were not like comfortable or for some reason felt that God was really the worthy one to lead them. I mean, so it's an interesting kind of relationship that the nation is still having with God, because they recognize prophets. They still hold them in high regard. They still obviously listen to what God is telling them, because here God is presenting Saul as their king. And even though some people, like I said, there was obviously people that did not agree with it from the get-go, for the most part, Israel accepted what God had decided and who he had chosen to be their first king. So it is an interesting kind of relationship there, that they didn't, God wasn't somehow a fit to be their king, but for God choosing, they're okay with that. It's interesting.
This is, I circled this little passage, or the little commentary on this. It relates to this. I thought this was put really well. Brueggemann says, surely those who requested a king in chapter 8 were sober and realistic, wanted a planner and a budgeter who would manage the economy and the army. They surely did not intend a king who would be moved by the wind of God out beyond their own hoped for vision of Israel. I really like the way he put that. It relates directly to what we're talking about. And it's the reason why I struggle. I think I struggle a lot with the way we approach church leadership sometimes, just because the same reason. I mean, because we're in the same boat that Israel is. We take all of and I think we do what we think God would want us to do. We take our best knowledge, our best insights, our best experience, and we consider all those things, and we make decisions that we think are best. And that just isn't often the way that God's people make decisions. They do so in some kind of being in tune. I mean, I'm not saying that they do things just to be different or just to be flippant, but rather than making those things primary, what's primary is this deep relationship they have with God. And so after Judas hangs himself and they need another apostle to fill the shoes, or to fill the vacancy, they didn't have a 2-hour debate about which one they should pick, but they cast lots. I mean, they literally rolled the dice to see which of these people would do it. And I mean, I would love, for me to grab Val and say, hey, we have this big decision facing our church, heads or tails, which one do you think we should do it? And I don't think that it's necessarily about the semantics of following at that, but I do think that here's a major moment in the life of of God's people, and whether they considered all those things or not, maybe that's what I mean. When what's interesting is the last chapter of our section today, which was chapter 10. Chapter 10 is really just spends time validating Saul to the people, because they're so shocked and which is funny because this isn't like a generation later. I mean, this is, you just asked for a king and now he's being presented, and so there are these episodes that kind of serve to kind of prove the validity of Saul, because he wasn't what they expected, and I just think. I think it speaks to, and maybe this is a way to really personalize this lesson and not just make it about these big, grand political things, but just when we make decisions, when we have a big decision in our life, how are we to make our decisions? I mean, we say we pray about them. Well, what do we think that's going to do? How do we think that somehow we're going to know what's the better? I'll open that up for you guys to maybe give an answer. But if say you've got a major decision facing yourself, whatever, fill in the blank, whatever it could be, and any one of us would say, hey, the most important thing to do is pray about it. Well, let's not stop there. Let's say, okay, I've been praying about it for a month or a week or two or whatever. How do we expect to know which way God is directing us? I don't think there's a right answer to this. I'm just curious.
No, yeah, that's good. There's not a right answer. But a couple of things. I think, as a side note, I think honestly, you talking about the casting of lots a little bit there reminded me. It's like, I think that for me, and maybe it's boring to other people, I think that would be kind of an interesting study to look at the discipline of casting lots and how that was used throughout the Bible. And how God used that method of decision making throughout the Bible. I think that's an interesting little thing. As a side note, maybe that's we could do that a little bit later sometime. But even the casting of the lots in this story in Saul, God already made up his mind, told that to Samuel, and had the things were already in motion. But then, like you mentioned in chapter 10, to basically, it was almost for show that they went through a process of casting lots where the tribe of Benjamin was isolated and chosen, and they brought in the tribe of Benjamin, and then they cast lots again, and then it was narrowed down to that family, and eventually Saul was, chosen as the king, where we saw a foreshadowing in the previous chapter where God already had done all that, but for the satisfaction of the people, God must have felt that there was a need to go through that process to basically validate, instead of it just being, it isn't just a cold turkey, this guy walks in the room and Samuel says, oh, that's your king. No, they go through this process, bring all the tribes and clans together, they cast lots, and they keep narrowing it down. I mean, I think it's a bizarre kind of story of how it unfolds and how ultimately Saul is presented to the people in that way. So I don't know. I find that a little fascinating because again, that's one of the few kind of disciplines or practices that does go all the way through the Old Testament into the New Testament, all the way up into Jesus's time, which I think that's kind of interesting. And I've always equated casting lots with faith. And like you said, you pray on it. You have people that are discerning on a subject, and it comes down many times to we do this, it's A or B. Okay, well, let's cast lots. And I think the way that we've been, our society, and for other reasons of gambling and different things that are in our psyche, we just equate casting lots to a random, uncontrolled way of things happening, where the people that had a deep faith in God, when they knew when they cast the lot, God was going to ultimately be the one that decided. And they absolutely, and then whatever the lot said, they knew that was God's providence that was speaking through that process. So I don't know. I think that's a fascinating thing. So
our next leadership meeting, Brian's going to propose paper, rock, scissors.
Yes.
See who it is.
Why not? I don't know, paper rock scissors still has a little bit too much control. I think just throwing a dice would be better, you know. But.
Well, I mean, to be fair, like they didn't like when they chose the apostles, the new apostle. They didn't do it. They didn't take the entire community and just whittle it down. They already had like so the idea that they're just going to just randomly do something wouldn't be totally fair. I mean, it does include, hey, we've talked about this, we've discussed this, we've used our brains, we've used common sense, we've gotten it down to these really, and it sounds like for most of these situations, these are both good to us, or these are both, positive to us. And so it's not necessarily about, I have no idea what to do right now, let me just point at a map and I'm going to move wherever I am. I don't think it's that kind of randomness. And that's why I think it does kind of funnel down into a little bit more of a movable thing. What about the rest of you? Marv, you a paper, rock, scissors prayer guy? A coin tosser?
Definitely, yeah, definitely prayer. I think I try to ask a lot of Christian friends about their position on different things, but at the end, Adam, I generally, not always, but get this peace of mind that I tried to reach you, God. I tried to do all I can as a human being to understand your will in this situation, and I'm going to leave it to you. And generally, when I make that decision and that framework, I get a peace about it. So,
what do you think, Deb? Are you a coin? I'm going to start asking people that. Are you a coin tosser when it comes to prayer? Say your prayer and then coins.
Oh, I've never done that. I was thinking using Dungeons and Dragons dice. Getting more selections there.
Yeah, you got all kinds of options that way. Yeah. I started reading St. Ignatius. It's been kind of my quiet time reading the last couple weeks. And he developed this practice several hundred years ago called the examen. And I think it speaks to this idea, and it's something that I'm not real familiar with, but something that kind of in our quest as a church to develop spiritual growth a little bit more, kind of caught my attention. And, basically what the examen is it's a 4-week process of discernment. And what he proposes along the way is every morning or every night, it just depends on it. And of course, it's like anything else, you can be as formulated or stringent as you want to. But he proposes that at the end or the beginning of every day, you go back through your previous day or that day and just go through the events of your day and think about the times that you might have missed the opportunity to hear the voice of God or see God or talk to somebody about God, or if there's a specific prayer that you've been saying for a long time, but it's just a process of discernment and reflection. And I think sometimes that's where all these things arise from. Marv, what you're talking about, I think is, I mean, you just want to seek some peace with it, because I think the thing to remember about this story is ultimately the people are faced with the decision and they choose the wrong thing. They want a king, and God says, I don't want you to have a king. And yet God still works through them and through their king to bring salvation to the world. I mean, that's what we don't want to lose sight of in this. For all the frustration we may feel for God in dealing with Israel, not only had Brian, you were talking about how he'd already chosen a king, he had already chosen David, and he had already chosen Jesus was going to be from the Davidic line. So even though we see these things kind of unfolding, that's where the sovereignty of God is at peace. It's not about trying to figure out God. I don't think that's, what does God want from me in this moment? And we realize that oftentimes we're not going to choose the better way. And I think that's what growth and maturity is about choosing the right way more often than not, and more often when you're 60 than you did when you were 40. And that there is some idea of growth, but it's not as though we're going to get it all figured out and all of a sudden be on God's side all the time. But even when we're not, God is still faithful, and his sovereignty will still prevail. And that to me is the big message out of the story. As we seek to learn more about God, what do we as Christians learn? That was what we started when we started talking about this story all those, a couple weeks ago. It's like, what are we going to learn about this story when we're dealing with all the stuff that we're dealing with? Well, the fact of the matter is, we're learning a lot about the fact that God can work with what we got. He can work with what we got. We're giving him. He can make it work. And when we make bad decisions and we go the ways that he wouldn't maybe prefer us to, not only does he manage, like that, you wouldn't say that about the monarchy, right? Well, he managed. I mean, he brought David into the story, and ultimately Jesus. And so I think that's a great kind of takeaway, and it helps. To me, that's not a real, we talked about kind of warned against moralizing these stories. It warns against that a little bit, and paints it in a bigger picture of just seeing what God is doing in these moments. And I think all the things we've talked about have kind of helped reinforce that.
Yeah, I love the wisdom in Marv's statement, and something that I continually, aspire to be more like as far as how I go about my life and walk with Christ is, learning that, you're right, having that peace, getting to the point where if it's a decision or whatever the thought process or the things that you do, your actions, to be at peace in those moments and move forward and accept that peace that is given through the situation when you give it up and you give it to God. That is a difficult thing to do, and to connect it to the conversation in leadership, Adam. That's you're exactly right. We have to, as a leader in the church or in any type of situation, a leader of people or your own family or whatever it may be, sometimes the most difficult thing to do is to understand that we made a decision, and going back and reliving and rehashing that decision after the fact doesn't do you or anybody else any good. I mean, if it's a decision that required a left turn or a right turn, the decision was made. So moving forward with the peace of mind that, it's still going to all work out. I'm not going to make any decision, or a group of churches or leadership is not going to make any one decision that's somehow going to disrupt God's plan and somehow end how the story ends. And it's going to, oh no, we've done it now. We've screwed it all up. I mean, none of us have the power to do that. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Marv was saying there. I think it's a great discipline that, again, I try to grab onto more and more, because that peace of mind in your heart and your mind and your soul is so important to try to free yourself up to do God's work. Because I don't know, if you're like me, sometimes you end up beating yourself up for hours, days, weeks, months because of a decision you made before, and things didn't turn out the way that you thought, and you think it's all because of you and your decision you made, and you can't move on from it.
I think it's related to the subtle thing we talked about last week. I think it was in this small group. We talked about the difference between talking about, God being on our side. We want to make sure God's on our side versus making sure we're on God's side. If we're worried about the fact that, am I doing what God needs me to do? Am I, then I think we have a tendency to put all that on our shoulders and feel like the weight of the world, because it's literally on us, because we're trying to figure out, man, is God on my side, versus I know that I'm on God's side, and that just brings about a peace where even if I make a mistake, even if I didn't choose the right ring or the right pill or whatever it is, we didn't choose rightly, then I think that helps bring peace. I mean, it's a subtlety kind of in semantics, but I think it if we look at it that way, I think it can give us a little bit of peace of mind. So that's probably a good place to stop. Any final words there from anybody?
Hey, as a side note, Val, you're throughout this whole class. I every time I see your head peek up there, I'm just reminded of the neighbor Wilson from Tool Time, that sitcom. Just like we need a little picket fence right there under your nose.
There you go.
Yeah.
I was about to say, if you could add that filter, man, that would be great. I haven't messed around with enough background. There's got to be some. That's funny.
How do you do that?
The backgrounds.
Yeah.
If you go up, well, I'm on my laptop. I don't know what you're using, your computer.
Yeah.
It's under video, where you can select the camera, and I've got to choose a video filter or background.
Oh, some kind of setup thing on this.
I was a little slow to the party. You can imagine the first time I had a Zoom meeting with our teenagers, this is pretty much all they did the entire time.
Oh, I don't know how you.
I didn't even know these were here. But yeah, you can upload, Val, so you can get that picket fence for the next time.
Okay.
I was thinking of putting myself in the bridge at the Enterprise.
Oh, I did. There you
go.
go.
Yeah.
That gives you a project to work on for next time.
Yeah, make